So one of my ongoing projects is to articulate theology in, I guess, what you could call a postmodern context, a context wherein not only has God died, but man has died, and the whole Western project of um, ascent to rational some enlightened, rational ordering of society and of self and of nature. Um, that whole project has collapsed in upon itself, and for the most part, everybody um, everybody knows that the dream is over. Um, and this has various social, political, and economic ramifications. The current financial crisis, the sort of fall of the American empire and American economic dominance. Um, this is a result of this sort of collapse of the industrial capitalist model for human development. And in this context, I think theology will and is becoming, and religion also are becoming more relevant. Not that science and technology and everything that we've gained through this rational enlightenment, the historical event that we call the Enlightenment, not that that is going to be superseded by religion, but rather, um, contrary to the self-understanding of Enlightenment rationalists and scientific mechanists, religion is not a remnant of a barbaric past or of a superstitious um, collective childhood. Religion, rather, is the very um, psychological and institutional foundation, or the soil, the psychological and social and institutional soil out of which the scientific revolution was given birth. So without this sort of background assumption provided by a basically Christian consciousness in Europe, the first scientists, Copernicus, Kepler, Descartes, Newton, even Galileo, they would not have been able to turn to nature as a designed machine, designed with perfect mathematical precision, unless they had first had this theological and religious idea of God as the supreme architect, the perfect architect and creator of the universe, who oversaw every detail of the universe's construction and continues to oversee it. None of the scientific theories that that the fathers of science articulated would have been possible without that imaginative background, without the theology of Christendom, which posited God as this sort of intelligent designer or engineer or demiurge. Now, of course, there are many problems with this image of God, and in my attempt to resurrect theology in a postmodern context, I certainly do not want to invoke this notion of an omnipotent designer deity that guided mainstream religious thought in Europe for many millennia. I think my attempt to revive and resurrect theology turns more to approaches like Alfred North Whitehead's and even Friedrich Schelling's, who both began to think God as creature, to think the creator as, in some sense, also caught up in creaturehood, and that, in Schelling's language, God has a nature, and this nature is in fact unconscious. It's that aspect of God which is dark rather than light. You see this aspect even in the sort of exoteric tradition in the Bible, in the book of Job. There's this inner critic we call Satan in the tradition that has a conversation with God. So God's ego, Yahweh, has this conversation with this unconscious persona, not integrated by God's ego, this unconscious persona in the larger nature of God, and this sort of evil thought in God emerges as Satan, which convinces God or Yahweh to subject Job to these various tortures, only to prove that he, in fact, really does love God. So it's as if God has this insecurity and wonders, does this human which I have created really love me? Does he realize that I am the most powerful one? And these voices of doubt start to arise in God. So you get this picture of God as a rather depraved, blind, and even selfish, egoic personality. And in this story, the Book of Job, especially as it's been interpreted by Carl Jung in his book Answer to Job, Job becomes in some ways superior, morally superior at least, to Yahweh. In that, in the end, Job does remain faithful to God despite all of these signs of God's hatred for him. And according to Jung, this is sort of the moment, and speaking mythically and symbolically on the level of the psychological and archetypal matrix within which we swim and from which we draw our emotional sustenance. It was this moment in our collective history when Yahweh realized the need for the Incarnation, the need for God's entrance into human history as a human being in the flesh. Because God saw that only by becoming finite could he also become all good. Clearly, Yahweh is all powerful, but is he all good? The story of Job's sufferings would seem to suggest otherwise. There are other lessons we could draw from Job, but I think this is an example of the way that God is not simply the distant designer and overseer of the universe and of human history and totally removed from all of those processes, those messy, chaotic processes, but rather God's very body is caught up in our human turmoils and caught up in the contingencies of the evolution of life and of the universe. Both Whitehead and Schelling will want to think the divine in this way as immanent. They're trying to think the soul of this world rather than to posit a heaven opposite or beyond this world. Part of, I think, a more esoteric or perhaps radical reading of the biblical tradition is that what Jesus was prophesying was that heaven would be on earth, and that in fact earth would become heaven, and that the revelation at the end of time is in fact the end of history and the beginning of eternity. If you can say that eternity can begin on earth, so it's an earthly eternity. And incarnation, the whole point of this notion of the divine's incarnation, of the Word becoming flesh, is that there is no afterlife, but that in fact this life here now is immortal, eternal, everlasting. If only we could discover the Christ consciousness which underlies our egoic consciousness. So as as Paul will write in his letters, not I, it is not I who live eternally, but the Christ in me. The ego and its body, its carnal suffering existence are crucified in this process of incarnation. And what resurrects is not the physical body, I would say, but the life body, which is a concept that will need a lot more unpacking. But for now, I think I want to end with a paragraph from Schelling's book or lectures that he gave in 1804 under the title Philosophy and Religion. And he writes, "The reality of God is not just a postulation made by morality. Rather, only he who recognizes God in whatever way is truly a moral person. Moral laws ought to be obeyed not because they are related to God as the lawmaker, or whatever other relationship the finite mind is able to conceive, but because the essence of God and that of morality are one and the same, and because by acting morally we are revealing the essence of God. By acting morally, we are revealing the essence of God. A moral world exists only if God exists, and to postulate his existence in order for a moral world to exist is a complete reversal of the true and necessary relations." So, in other words, what Schelling is arguing here is not that there must be a God in order for our sense of morality and good and evil to exist, and that if we don't posit the existence of a God, then we sort of, as a result, fall into this moral relativism. He's not trying to marshal a God argument that he might posit in order to give rise to morality. He's saying that the very existence of morality and our capacity to act morally is itself the evidence of God's existence. So if one were to want to prove God's existence, one wouldn't make postulates about various rational or scientific reasons that God must exist. Rather, one would simply act morally, and that action would itself be the evidence of God's existence. In a similar way, we could say that faith is a form of evidence, and the existence of the faithful, of people with faith, is precisely the evidence that we would want to look for in order to know that God was real. And if it follows that if faith dries up, if religion dies, then so does God. So, as Whitehead will say in several places, the power of religion is the worship it inspires. And in fact, the power of God is the worship that God inspires, and that there's an identity between human religious life and the life of the divine. These aren't separate things. It's not as if God is outside of our worship and our prayer, our meditation, the various forms of spiritual practice that give witness to the presence of the infinite in the finite, the presence of the divine or the heavenly in the earthly. Certainly, Christian Europe doesn't have a monopoly on spirit, right? Spirit blows where it wills. So, just some thoughts for you to ponder and for you to disagree with if you so dare. But I do encourage you to dare to disagree. I look forward to it, in fact. So, thanks for listening.